If I asked you if you slept well and you told me no, how many of you would then tell me that it was because you were hexed? Hi everybody, it's Sarah from Hushed Up History, and I invite you now to come with me to Pennsylvania to learn about the witch and the wrath of Ringtown. On March 17, 1934, Albert Shinsky stopped the car outside of the house, fully confident in what he was about to do. Albert was only 23 years old, but since the age of 17, he had been tormented by one thing after another. He knew the cause, even if no one else believed him, and now he knew how to stop it. He got out of his car, hands full, and told himself that finally, after tonight, he would be able to sleep. Susan Mummy had lived on her secluded farm in Ringtown, Pennsylvania for approximately 25 years with her husband Henry and her daughter. She was 64 years old and had led a volatile existence for every one of those years. On July 5th, 1910, Mummy awoke from a dream where she was told that if her husband went to work that day, she would never see him again. She begged him to stay home, but he ignored her and made his way off to the processing plant where he worked in the manufacturing of gunpowder. That day, there was an explosion at the processing plant, and Henry did not survive. Mummy was not liked in her community, and this premonition only gave more people another reason to stay away from the angry and quarrelsome woman. There had been rumors circulating for years that she practiced a specific type of witchcraft, and the loss of her husband did not earn her any sympathy. If anything, it only marked her with a stronger sense of dread. She had predicted the death of her husband. She was clearly a witch. People told stories about Mummy hexing people and casting the evil eye, but it is unknown if Albert Shinsky knew of these allegations or believed them when he encountered her. When Shinsky was 17 years old, by all accounts, he had a good life. He was healthy, polite, energetic. He came from a very well-respected family. He was engaged, and he had a job working on a local farm next door to Mummy's property. And he was working on the farm the day that the property lines between the farmer and Mummy caused the two to get into a very heated exchange. Later that day, Shinsky was walking through the property when he unexpectedly encountered Mummy. According to Shinsky, he felt her gaze before he ever saw it, but when their eyes did meet, he broke out into a cold sweat, he felt a grip forming around his neck, and he was completely filled with fear. He walked away from the woman physically unharmed, but he was never the same after this encounter. The formerly vibrant young man was now constantly exhausted, unable to eat, unable to sleep, and plagued by heavy mental torments. As time moved on, the decline of Albert Shinsky became more and more alarming. He became completely emaciated, broken, and beaten down. And although he was able to find work here and there, he was never able to hold a job for any length of time. For years, the residents of Ringtown, Pennsylvania watched one of their stellar sons completely fall apart, but they could only see what was happening on the outside. When Shinsky pulled up to Mummy's house that March 17th, he got out of his car and grabbed his shotgun. He then filled it with pumpkin balls, homemade lead slugs made specifically to kill witches. Mummy was in the house with her daughter and a boarder named Jacob Rice, who had a severely injured foot. Mummy was tending to the injured foot when the pumpkin balls tore through her house and through her. Mummy collapsed to the floor dead after the pumpkin balls pierced her lungs and her heart. When the news of Mummy's murder hit local ears, there was no immediate suspect or shock. She was so strongly disliked by everyone that it was not surprising that someone decided to take her out. But there was one big clue to the culprit. Several days later, a group of boys reported seeing a car parked outside of her house the night of the murder. And when the owner of that car was found and revealed, that shocked the community more than the crime itself. How could this be? How could a revered son of Ringtown commit this cold-blooded crime? And was it even true? But everyone got their answers very quickly. When the police questioned Shinsky as to why he was in the area the night of the murder, he calmly and coolly said to them, "I went out there to kill Mrs. Mummy." The account that Albert Shinsky gave the police painted a bizarre picture of torment. He told them about his encounter with her years earlier when their eyes met in that gaze, claiming that it was that gaze that was responsible for his downfall, telling them, "She put a hex on me that day." He told the police that since that day, he had been subjected to constant torture from the witch, always feeling like he was being choked, the constant feeling of pressure pushing his shoulders down, and being pinched at all hours, day and night. But none of this compared to the cat. According to Shinsky, every night, a black cat with glowing eyes would come out of the sky and torment him while he was trying to sleep. It would scratch and claw at him before transforming into Mummy's face in order to remind him who was causing the torment. He then told the police, quote, "The cat would grow so large that I was almost smothered in its fur. It would spit and snarl at me. Its eyes glowed red with fire." He went on to explain that there were nights that he could not even walk upstairs to his bedroom because if he walked unevenly, the cat would come from the sky and launch at him. You would never do that, right, Funyun? Yes, she would. She definitely would. He also wanted to make clear that murder was not his first thought, but that for years he had consulted doctors and other practitioners of witchcraft, and that no medicine, amulet, potion, or prayer had brought him any relief. Finally, he said one night he got his answer when a spirit visited him and told him that the cure for all of his problems was to kill Susan Mummy. He didn't want to kill her, but he had to kill her. And he claimed that it worked, saying that the moment Mummy was dead, he was a reborn man. He was completely without remorse, completely optimistic, even upbeat, to a level that made everything about the murder even more disturbing. Later on in jail, he told reporters simply, "I had to kill her," claiming that the electric chair would have been better than all of the years of suffering he had just endured at the hand of the witch. Amazingly, not everyone thought that Shinsky's confession was the ramblings of a lunatic, and more people started coming forward claiming that they too had been hexed by Mummy, only feeling relief after she had died. Even Shinsky's fiancée came forward claiming that the hex was real and that she was a first-hand witness to all of the tortures that he had endured at the hands of the witch. She also claimed that at one point he asked Mummy for a reprieve and she denied him. According to her, what else was he supposed to do? He had to kill her. He did not tell his fiancée about the murder, but she knew something had happened because she told reporters that very suddenly he was acting as if something had been removed from him. She did not bother to ask why. Although Shinsky aggressively denied being insane, psychiatrists felt differently and diagnosed him with severe schizophrenia. Instead of going to trial, they recommended he be committed to the Fairview State Hospital for the Criminally Insane. The term hospital could be very loosely applied to Fairview. It was a massive complex where neglect and abuse were rampant. Shinsky checked into this nightmare and remained there for several decades. It is unknown what Shinsky endured while he was at Fairview, but by 1975, his story about what put him there in the first place had changed dramatically, with him stating, "I was a stupid, foolish, superstitious young man when I did the murder, but I do think I've been punished enough." In 1976, a judge determined that Shinsky was competent enough to go to trial for the murder of Susan Mummy. But the trial never happened. He actually agreed with Shinsky that he had been punished enough, and he was released with the murder never going before a court. Albert Shinsky returned home to Ringtown, Pennsylvania, where he remained until his death in May of 1983.
We are the hushed-up history. They tried to bury us, but the sea won't forget.
Does anybody else remember in the 80s and 90s when we talked about the Bermuda Triangle like it was lurking around every corner waiting to jump out and get us? It wasn't the only one. Hi everybody, it's Sarah from Hushed Up History, and today we are going to go to Michigan. And I apologize in advance because I'm probably going to mispronounce everything. On any given summer day, the scene on Lake Michigan is nothing short of idyllic. The lake, stretching over 300 miles long, plays host to thousands of people on boats, cruising along on the water and enjoying the scenery. Many of these people are tourists, and what they don't know is that they are spending their time relaxing on a body of water that has been marked by decades and decades of disasters, doom, and disappearances. Misfortune is common on Lake Michigan, but there are a couple instances that stand out. And they're all standing in the same region. Stretching between Benton Harbor, Michigan, Ludington, Michigan, and Manitowoc, Wisconsin, is the Michigan Triangle, a region that has been the scene of enough instances to wrap it in a thick air of mystery to rival that other tropical triangle over 1,000 miles away. One of the earliest mysteries of Lake Michigan took place in 1891 with the voyage of the Thomas Hume. The 132-foot-long schooner was part of a very active lumber industry operating on the lake, and it took regular trips between Chicago and Muskegon, Michigan. On May 21, 1891, the vessel was due to leave Chicago when a squall started kicking up the waves and raising the wind to dangerous speeds. Captain Harry Albrightson more than likely believed that recent repairs to the Thomas Hume meant that it was going to be able to slice through the storm with no problem, and he and his crew of 7 departed Chicago alongside multiple other ships that day. But, whereas the other ships reevaluated the situation and turned back, he did not. One of the last vessels to see the Thomas Hume in motion was the Rouse Simmons, and when they arrived in Muskegon 2 days later, the ship was nowhere to be found. They asked around, and that's when they realized that it wasn't that they had missed each other. The Thomas Hume had never arrived. The owners of the schooner ordered searches through the lake and any other surrounding ports, but they found nothing. There was no sightings, there was no reports, there wasn't even any debris. The Thomas Hume and its crew were seamlessly swallowed up by the storm and vanished. The disappearance of the Thomas Hume remained a mystery until 1990, when a schooner was found at the bottom of Lake Michigan, but it could not be positively identified as the missing ship. Remarkably, the schooner resting on the bottom of Lake Michigan was sitting so completely upright, and it was so solid in this place of rest that things like dishware and hats were still sitting on the shelves, untouched by time. Although they could not confirm it 100%, 20 years after the initial discovery, a dive team was investigating the wreck, and they found multiple attributes that were unique to the Thomas Hume. The vessel assumed to be the Thomas Hume remains at the bottom of Lake Michigan. The crew was never found or accounted for, and the final moments that placed the ship at the bottom of the lake fully intact and upright has never been pieced together. On October 30th, 1921, another lumber-carrying schooner, the Rosabelle, departed High Island loaded with cargo. It was headed to Benton Harbor, Michigan, but, like the Thomas Hume, it never made it to its final destination. Less than 24 hours after its departure, it was spotted in the water, and it was clear that something had gone very wrong. It was found approximately 42 miles from Milwaukee, and it was in the water, floating aimlessly, flipped completely upside down. A captain from a nearby ferry station noted that it looked like the ship had been involved in a very serious collision. Entire sections of the vessel had been smashed in, and the rigging and whole cabins had become detached and were now floating on their own in the water. Everybody wanted to know what had happened, but there was no one to ask. The entire 11-person crew was gone. What only added to this mystery is that there were no collisions reported in the area, and there were no ships in the region that showed any type of damage that would have indicated being involved in such a catastrophic crash. As details started to come to light, anyone who was familiar with the Rosabelle and its history may have started to have a little bit of deja vu. Over 40 years earlier, the Rosabelle was involved in her first wreck, and after the schooner had capsized, it floated over to Grand Harbor, Michigan, which was almost directly across from where the ship was now found in 1921. After the 1875 wreck, the Rosabelle was rebuilt and put back out to service. But that was not going to be the case this time. Now, the remnants of the ship were intentionally beached and it was dismantled after the cargo was removed. Interestingly, the Coast Guard determined that the Rosabelle was not involved in a collision, and it was left at that. And like the Thomas Hume, the end of the Rosabelle was never solved. Another mystery of Lake Michigan took place in April of 1937, when the lake freighter O.M. McFarlane arrived at its destination, but its captain did not. On the 28th of that month, Captain George R. Donner had just successfully navigated through a treacherous stretch of travel, maneuvering the O.M. McFarlane through dangerous sections of ice and bringing it to safer waters. At approximately 10:15 p.m., the exhausted captain told his crew that he was going to his cabin for some rest, but he wanted to be alerted when they started to approach their final destination of Port Washington, Wisconsin. 3 hours later, the O.M. McFarlane approached port, and the second mate went to Captain Donner's cabin to wake him up. He knocked on the door and received no response, but then when he tried to open the door, he learned that it had been locked from the inside. The concerned crew member broke down the door, and that's where it got worse, because what he found inside was nothing. No captain and no explanation to where he was. Thinking maybe the captain woke up earlier, went to go get something to drink, went to go get something to eat, or something to that effect, the crew member went up to the galley and other various parts of the ship asking everyone where the captain was. But no one had seen him. No one had seen the captain at all since he entered his cabin at 10:15 that night. An investigation was conducted throughout the 34-year-old ship, but there was no trace of Captain Donner. It was well documented and witnessed that he entered his cabin at approximately 10:15 p.m. and walked around a little bit before the cabin fell silent. There was no other way in or out of the cabin, and it was impossible that he would have fit through either of the portholes in his room. Captain Donner disappeared without a trace on his 58th birthday, and he was never seen or heard from again. Among the many mysterious stories of Lake Michigan, one of its most tragic is the story of Northwest Airlines Flight 2501. On June 23, 1950, the flight departed New York and headed for Seattle. This was a completely routine flight for the airline, one that was conducted on an almost daily basis. But this flight was going to be completely different. When Flight 2501 took off, it did so with 55 passengers and 3 crew members, and the first half of the flight was uneventful. There was a scheduled stop in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and at 11:51 p.m., Captain Robert C. Lind was flying the plane directly over Battle Creek, Michigan. At 12:15 a.m., Captain Lind contacted air traffic control in Chicago, asking for permission to descend from 3,500 feet to 2,500 feet. He did not give a reason for this request, but it was denied due to the volume of traffic already in the airspace at the time. It was the last time anyone from Flight 2501 was ever heard from again. As part of its route, Flight 2501 was scheduled to fly over Milwaukee, but as the hours moved along, Northwest Radio in Milwaukee alerted New York, Minneapolis, and Chicago that the plane had never approached. Attempts were made on all frequencies to contact the plane, but there was no response. The craft also was not appearing on any radar. Although not mentioned by Captain Lind in his request, it was confirmed shortly after that there were violent storms thrashing the Lake Michigan region. Several more attempts were made to contact the plane, but when there was no response, rescue units were put on standby. By the time morning broke, it was painfully clear that Flight 2501 was lost over Lake Michigan. The U.S. Coast Guard, the U.S. Navy, and multiple branches of law enforcement initiated an extensive search over the fog-covered lake. 13 hours later, their worst fears were confirmed, with the discovery of an oil slick, some debris, and a flight logbook floating in the waters approximately 18 miles northwest of Benton Harbor, Michigan. As the search progressed, large amounts of debris were found, including fuel tanks, pieces of the chairs, blankets from the airline, and unfortunately, human remains were also found in the waters. The plane itself, however, was still missing. Dive teams were dispatched to try to find any significant part of the aircraft itself, but it was not very successful. The mud was extremely thick. Visibility was less than 8 inches, and just navigating through the waters of Lake Michigan was extremely difficult. The search was conducted to the best of their ability, but after 2 days of only finding a large amount of small pieces of debris, the Coast Guard called off the remainder of the search, stating that there was no evidence that the plane was intact or that it would ever be found. The body of the plane was in fact never found, and at the time, the crash of Flight 2501 was the deadliest commercial airliner accident in American history. Although it became known that there were severe storms over that part of Lake Michigan that evening, no definitive cause of the crash has ever been cited. Captain Lind did not mention the weather at all in his request, and there were no other emergency alerts from any other planes in the area that night. Over the course of 2 weeks, hundreds of people came forward reporting that they had seen a plane in the sky that night, but that something had gone very wrong. They reported that the plane sounded faulty, and many witnesses reported seeing a single flash of very bright light, saying that it, quote, looked like the sun when it goes down. It only lasted a second, and then it was gone. The official cause of the disaster has been listed as unknown, and no significant part of the aircraft has ever been recovered. Alongside the many, many disasters that have taken place on Lake Michigan, there are multiple accounts of UFO sightings, sea serpents, ghost ships, and an ancient rock formation at the bottom of the lake referred to as the Stonehenge of Lake Michigan. All of this together firmly places the lake on the radar of anyone with any interest in history or the unexplained. In any conversation about the most mysterious places on Earth, the Bermuda Triangle is sure to come up. However, even though it is much smaller and much colder, the Michigan Triangle is also a storybook of the unexplained, with some chapters just as dark as the waters churning on its shores.